What do you know about Kissinger? From birth to the day of his departure. Part 2. A major concern for Kissinger was the possibility of Soviet influence in the Persian Gulf. In April 1969, Iraq came into conflict with Iran when Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi renounced the 1937 treaty governing the Shatt al-Arab River. On December 1, 1971, after 2 years of skirmishes along the border, President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr broke off diplomatic relations with Iran. In May 1972, Nixon and Kissinger visited Tehran to tell the Shah that there would be no second-guessing of his requests to buy American weapons. At the same time, Nixon and Kissinger agreed to a plan of the Shah's that the United States, together with Iran and Israel, would support the Kurdish Peshmerga guerrillas fighting for independence from Iraq. Kissinger later wrote that after Vietnam, there was no possibility of deploying American forces in the Middle East, and henceforward Iran was to act as America's surrogate in the Persian Gulf. Kissinger described the Ba'athist regime in Iraq as a potential threat to the United States and believed that building up Iran and supporting the Peshmerga was the best counterweight. In 1970, Kissinger parroted to Nixon the United States Department of Defense's position that the country should maintain control over the Panama Canal, which was a reversal of the commitment by the Lyndon Johnson administration. Later, in the face of international pressure, Kissinger changed his stance, viewing the past hardline position in the Panama Canal issue as a hindrance to American relations with Latin America and an international setback that the Soviet Union would approve of. Kissinger in 1973 called for new dialogue between the United States and Latin America. Then in 1974, Kissinger met Panama military leader Omar Torrijos, and an agreement on 8 operating principles for an eventual handover of the Panama Canal to Panama was made between Kissinger and Panamanian Foreign Minister Juan Antonio Tac, which angered the United States Congress, but ultimately provided a framework for the 1977 U.S.-Panama Treaties. Kissinger initially supported the normalization of United States-Cuba relations. Broken since 1961, all U.S.-Cuban trade was blocked in February 1962, a few weeks after the exclusion of Cuba from the Organization of American States because of U.S. pressure. However, he quickly changed his mind and followed Kennedy's policy. After the involvement of the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces in the independence struggles in Angola and Mozambique, Kissinger said that unless Cuba withdrew its forces, relations would not be normalized. Cuba refused. Chilean Socialist Party presidential candidate Salvador Allende was elected by a plurality of 36.2% in 1970, causing serious concern in Washington, D.C., due to his openly socialist and pro-Cuban politics. The Nixon administration, with Kissinger's input, authorized the Central Intelligence Agency to encourage a military coup that would prevent Allende's inauguration, but the plan was not successful. On September 11, 1973, Allende died during an army attack on the presidential palace that was an element of a military coup launched by Army Commander-in-Chief Augusto Pinochet, who then became president. In September 1976, Orlando Letelier, a Chilean opponent of the new Pinochet regime, was assassinated in Washington, D.C., with a car bomb. Previously, Kissinger had helped secure his release from prison and had chosen to cancel an official U.S. letter to Chile warning them against carrying out any political assassinations. This murder was part of Operation Condor, a covert program of political repression and assassination carried out by Southern Cone nations that Kissinger has been accused of being involved in. On September 10, 2001, after recent declassification of documents, relatives and survivors of General René Schneider filed civil proceedings against Kissinger in federal court in Washington, D.C., accusing him of collaborating in arranging Schneider's kidnapping, which resulted in his death. The case was later dismissed by the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, citing separation of powers. The decision to support a coup of the Chilean government to prevent Dr. Allende from coming to power, and the means by which the United States government sought to effect that goal, implicate policymakers in the murky realm of foreign affairs and national security best left to the political branches. Decades later, the CIA admitted its involvement in the kidnapping of General Schneider, but not his murder, and subsequently paid the group responsible for his death $35,000 to keep the prior contacts secret, maintain the goodwill of the group, and for humanitarian reasons. Kissinger took a similar line as he had toward Chile when the Argentine armed forces, led by Jorge Videla, toppled the elected government of Isabel Perón in 1976 with a process called the National Reorganization Process by the military, with which they consolidated power, launching brutal reprisals, and disappearances against political opponents. An October 1987 investigative report in The Nation broke the story of how, in a June 1976 meeting in the Hotel Cara in Santiago, Kissinger gave the military junta in neighboring Argentina the green light for their own clandestine repression against left-wing guerrillas and other dissidents, thousands of whom were kept in more than 400 secret concentration camps before they were executed. During a meeting with Argentine Foreign Minister Cesar Augusto Gazzetti, Kissinger assured him that the United States was an ally but urged him to get back to normal procedures quickly before the U.S. Congress reconvened and had a chance to consider sanctions. As the article published in The Nation noted, as the state-sponsored terror mounted, conservative Republican U.S. Ambassador to Buenos Aires Robert C. Hill was shaken. He became very disturbed by the case of the son of a 30-year embassy employee, a student who was arrested, never to be seen again, recalled Juan de Onis, former reporter for the New York Times. Hill took a personal interest. He went to the Interior Minister, a general with whom he had worked on drug cases, saying, "Hey, what about this? We're interested in this case." He questioned Foreign Minister Cesar Gazzetti, and, finally, President Jorge Videla himself. All he got was stonewalling. He got nowhere. De Onis said. His last year was marked by increasing disillusionment and dismay, and he backed his staff on human rights right to the hilt. In a letter to The Nation editor Victor Navasky, protesting publication of the article, Kissinger claimed that, at any rate, the notion of Hill as a passionate human rights advocate is news to all his former associates. Yet Kissinger aide Harry W. Schlotterman later disagreed with Kissinger, telling the oral historian William E. Knight of the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training Foreign Affairs Oral History Project, "It really came to a head when I was assistant secretary, or it began to come to a head in the case of Argentina where the dirty war was in full flower." Bob Hill, who was ambassador then in Buenos Aires, a very conservative Republican politician, by no means liberal or anything of the kind, began to report quite effectively about what was going on. This slaughter of innocent civilians, supposedly innocent civilians, this vicious war that they were conducting. Underground war. He, at one time in fact, sent me a back-channel telegram saying that the foreign minister, who had just come for a visit to Washington and had returned to Buenos Aires, had gloated to him that Kissinger had said nothing to him about human rights. I don't know, I wasn't present at the interview. Navasky later wrote in his book about being confronted by Kissinger. "Tell me, Mr. Navasky," Kissinger said in his famous guttural tones, "how is it that a short article in an obscure journal such as yours about a conversation that was supposed to have taken place years ago about something that did or didn't happen in Argentina resulted in 60 people holding placards denouncing me a few months ago at the airport when I got off the plane in Copenhagen?" According to declassified State Department files, Kissinger also hindered the Carter administration's efforts to halt the mass killings by the 1,976,198 military dictatorship by visiting the country as Videla's personal guest to attend 1978 FIFA World Cup and praising the regime. Kissinger was in favor of accommodating Brazil while it pursued a nuclear weapons program in the 1970s. Kissinger justified his position by arguing that Brazil was a U.S. ally, and on the grounds that it would benefit private nuclear industry actors in the U.S. Kissinger's position on Brazil was out of sync with influential voices in the U.S. Congress, the State Department, and the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. In September 1976, Kissinger was actively involved in negotiations regarding the Rhodesian-Bush War. Kissinger, along with South Africa's Prime Minister John Vorster, pressured Rhodesian Prime Minister Ian Smith to hasten the transition to black majority rule in Rhodesia. With Frelimo in control of Mozambique and even the apartheid regime of South Africa withdrawing its support, Rhodesia's isolation was nearly complete. According to Smith's autobiography, Kissinger told Smith of Mrs. Kissinger's admiration for him, but Smith stated that he thought Kissinger was asking him to sign Rhodesia's death certificate. Kissinger, bringing the weight of the United States and corralling other relevant parties to put pressure on Rhodesia, hastened the end of white minority rule. In contrast to the unfriendly disposition of the previous Kennedy and Johnson administrations towards the Estado Novo regime of Portugal, particularly with regards to its attempts to maintain the Portuguese colonial empire by waging the Portuguese colonial war against anti-colonial rebellions in defense of its empire, the Department of State under Kissinger adopted a more conciliatory attitude towards Portugal. In 1971, the administration of President Nixon successfully renewed the lease of the American military base in the Azores, despite condemnation from the Congressional Black Caucus and some members of the Senate. though privately continuing to view Portugal contemptibly for its perceived atavistic foreign policy towards Africa. Kissinger publicly expressed thanks for Portugal's agreement to use its military base in Lage in the Azores to resupply Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Following the fall of the far-right Portuguese regime in 1974, Kissinger worried that the new government's hasty decolonization plan might benefit radical factions such as the MPLA in Angola. He also expressed concern that the inclusion of the Portuguese Communist Party in the new Portuguese government could legitimize communist parties in other NATO member states, such as Italy. The Portuguese decolonization process brought U.S. attention to the former Portuguese colony of East Timor, which declared its independence in 1975. Indonesian President Suharto regarded East Timor as rightfully part of Indonesia. In December 1975, Suharto discussed invasion plans during a meeting with Kissinger and President Ford in the Indonesian capital of Jakarta. Both Ford and Kissinger made clear that U.S. relations with Indonesia would remain strong and that it would not object to the proposed annexation. They only wanted it done fast and proposed that it be delayed until after they had returned to Washington. Accordingly, Suharto delayed the operation for 1 day. Finally, on December 7, Indonesian forces invaded the former Portuguese colony. U.S. arms sales to Indonesia continued, and Suharto went ahead with the annexation plan. According to Ben Kiernan, the invasion and occupation resulted in the deaths of nearly a quarter of the Timor's population from 1975 to 1981. During the 1970 Cienfuegos crisis, in which the Soviet Navy was strongly suspected of building a submarine base in the Cuban city of Cienfuegos, Kissinger met with Anatoly Dobrynin, Soviet ambassador to the United States, informing him that the United States government considered this act a violation of the agreements made in 1962 by President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, prompting the Soviets to halt construction of their planned base in Cienfuegos. In February 1976, Kissinger considered launching airstrikes against ports and military installations in Cuba, as well as deploying U.S. Marine Corps battalions based at the U.S. Navy base at Guantanamo Bay, in retaliation for Cuban President Fidel Castro's decision in late 1975 to send troops to newly independent Angola to help the MPLA in its fight against UNITA and South Africa during the start of the Angolan Civil War. The Kissingerian doctrine endorsed the forced concession of Spanish Sahara to Morocco. At the height of the 1975 Sahara crisis, Kissinger misled Gerald Ford into thinking the International Court of Justice had ruled in favor of Morocco. Kissinger was aware in advance of the Moroccan plans for the invasion of the territory, materialized on November 6, 1975, in the so-called Green March. Kissinger was involved in furthering cooperation between the U.S. and the Zairian dictator Mobutu Sese Seko, and held multiple meetings with him. Kissinger later described these efforts as one of our policy successes in Africa, and praised Mobutu as courageous, politically astute and relatively honest in a country where governmental corruption is a way of life. After Nixon was forced to resign in the Watergate scandal, Kissinger's influence in the new presidential administration of Gerald R. Ford was diminished after he was replaced by Brent Scowcroft as National Security Advisor during the Halloween Massacre cabinet reshuffle of November 1975. Kissinger left office as Secretary of State when Democrat Jimmy Carter defeated Republican Gerald Ford in the 1976 presidential election. Kissinger continued to participate in policy groups, such as the Trilateral Commission, and to maintain political consulting, speaking, and writing engagements. In 1978, he was secretly involved in thwarting efforts by the Carter administration to indict 3 Chilean intelligence agents for masterminding the 1976 assassination of Orlando Letelier. Kissinger was critical of the foreign policy of the Jimmy Carter administration, saying in 1980 that has managed the extraordinary feat of having, at one and the same time, the worst relations with our allies, the worst relations with our adversaries, and the most serious upheavals in the developing world since the end of the Second World War. After Kissinger left office in 1977, he was offered an endowed chair at Columbia University, which met with student opposition. Kissinger instead accepted a position at Georgetown University's Center for Strategic and International Studies. He taught at Georgetown's Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service for several years in the late 1970s. In 1982, with the help of a loan from the international banking firm of M. Warburg, Pincus & Company, Kissinger founded a consulting firm, Kissinger Associates, and was a partner in affiliate Kissinger-McLarty Associates with Mac McLarty, former Chief of Staff to President Bill Clinton. He also served on the board of directors of Hollinger International, a Chicago-based newspaper group, and as of March 1999, was a director of Gulfstream Aerospace. In September 1989, The Wall Street Journal's John Fialka disclosed that Kissinger took a direct economic interest in U.S.-China relations in March 1989 with the establishment of China Ventures, Inc., a Delaware limited partnership, of which he was chairman of the board and chief executive officer. A U.S. $75 million investment in a joint venture with the Communist Party government's primary commercial vehicle at the time, China International Trust and Investment Corporation CITIC, was its purpose. Board members were major clients of Kissinger Associates. Kissinger was criticized for not disclosing his role in the venture when called upon by ABC's Peter Jennings to comment the morning after the June 4, 1989, Tiananmen Square massacre. Kissinger's position was generally supportive of Deng Xiaoping's decision to use the military against the demonstrating students, and he opposed economic sanctions. From 1995 to 2001, Kissinger served on the board of directors for Freeport-McMoRan, a multinational copper and gold producer with significant mining and milling operations in Papua, Indonesia. In February 2000, President of Indonesia Abdurrahman Wahid appointed Kissinger as a political advisor. He also served as an honorary advisor to the United States-Azerbaijan Chamber of Commerce. In 1998, in response to the 2002 Winter Olympic bid scandal, the International Olympic Committee formed a commission, called the 2000 Commission, to recommend reforms, which Kissinger served on. This service led in 2000 to his appointment as one of 5 IOC honor member, a category the organization described as granted to eminent personalities from outside the IOC who have rendered particularly outstanding services to it. Kissinger served as the 22nd Chancellor of the College of William and Mary from 2000 to 2005. He was preceded by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and succeeded by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. The College of William and Mary also own a painted portrait of Kissinger that was painted by Ned Bittinger. From 2000 to 2006, Kissinger served as chairman of the Board of Trustees of Eisenhower Fellowships. In 2006, upon his departure from Eisenhower Fellowships, he received the Dwight D. Eisenhower Medal for Leadership in Service. In November 2002, he was appointed by President George W. Bush to chair the newly established National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States to investigate the September 11th attacks. Kissinger stepped down as chairman on December 13, 2002, rather than reveal his business client list when queried about potential conflicts of interest. In the Rio Tinto espionage case of 29210, Kissinger was paid $5 million to advise the multinational mining company how to distance itself from an employee who had been arrested in China for bribery. Kissinger, along with William Perry, Sam Nunn, and George Shultz, called upon governments to embrace the vision of a world free of nuclear weapons, and in 3 op-eds in the Wall Street Journal proposed an ambitious program of urgent steps to that end. The 4 created the Nuclear Threat Initiative to advance this agenda. In 2010, the 4 were featured in a documentary film entitled Nuclear Tipping Point. The film is a visual and historical depiction of the ideas laid forth in the Wall Street Journal op-eds and reinforces their commitment to a world without nuclear weapons and the steps that can be taken to reach that goal. On November 17, 2016, Kissinger met with President-elect Donald Trump, during which they discussed global affairs. Kissinger also met with President Trump at the White House in May 2017. In an interview with Charlie Rose on August 17, 2017, Kissinger said about President Trump, "I'm hoping for an Augustinian moment for St. Augustine, who in his early life followed a pattern that was quite incompatible with later on when he had a vision and rose to sainthood. One does not expect the president to become that, but it's conceivable." Kissinger also argued that Russian President Vladimir Putin wanted to weaken Hillary Clinton, not elect Donald Trump. Kissinger said that Putin thought, wrongly incidentally, that she would be extremely confrontational. "I think he tried to weaken the incoming President Clinton." In several articles of his and interviews that he gave during the Yugoslav wars, he criticized the United States' policies in Southeast Europe, among other things for the recognition of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a sovereign state, which he described as a foolish act. Most importantly, he dismissed the notion of Serbs and Croats being aggressors or separatists, saying that they can't be separating from something that has never existed. In addition, he repeatedly warned the West against inserting itself into a conflict that has its roots at least hundreds of years back in time, and said that the West would do better if it allowed the Serbs and Croats to join their respective countries. Kissinger shared similarly critical views on Western involvement in Kosovo. In particular, he held a disparaging view of the Rambouillet Agreement. The Rambouillet text, which called on Serbia to admit NATO troops throughout Yugoslavia, was a provocation, an excuse to start bombing. Rambouillet is not a document that any Serb could have accepted. It was a terrible diplomatic document that should never have been presented in that form. However, as the Serbs did not accept the Rambouillet text and NATO bombing started, he opted for a continuation of the bombing as NATO's credibility was now at stake, but dismissed the use of ground forces, claiming that it was not worth it. In 2006, it was reported in the book State of Denial by Bob Woodward that Kissinger met regularly with President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney to offer advice on the Iraq War. Kissinger confirmed in recorded interviews with Woodward that the advice was the same as he had given in a column in the Washington Post on August 12, 2005. Victory over the insurgency is the only meaningful exit strategy. Kissinger also frequently met with U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, whom he warned that Coalition Provisional Authority Director L. Paul Bremer was a control freak. In an interview on the BBC's Sunday AM on November 19, 2006, Kissinger was asked whether there was any hope left for a clear military victory in Iraq and responded, "If you mean by military victory an Iraqi government that can be established, and whose writ runs across the whole country, that gets the civil war under control and sectarian violence under control in a time period that the political processes of the democracies will support, I don't believe that is possible. I think we have to redefine the course. But I don't believe that the alternative is between military victory as it had been defined previously, or total withdrawal." In an interview with Peter Robinson of the Hoover Institution on April 3, 2008, Kissinger reiterated that even though he supported the 2003 invasion of Iraq, he thought that the George W. Bush administration rested too much of its case for war on Saddam's supposed weapons of mass destruction. Robinson noted that Kissinger had criticized the administration for invading with too few troops, for disbanding the Iraqi army as part of de-Baathification, and for mishandling relations with certain allies. Kissinger said in April 2008 that India has parallel objectives to the United States, and he called the nation an ally of the U.S. A few months before the Games opened, as controversy over China's human rights record was intensifying due to criticism by Amnesty International and other groups of the widespread use of the death penalty and other issues, Kissinger told the PRC's official press agency Xinhua, "I think one should separate Olympics as a sporting event from whatever political disagreements people may have had with China. I expect that the Games will proceed in the spirit for which they were designed, which is friendship among nations, and that other issues are discussed in other forums." He said China had made huge efforts to stage the Games. He added that he would bring 2 of his grandchildren to watch the Games and planned to attend the opening ceremony. During the Games, he participated with Australian swimmer Ian Thorpe, film star Jackie Chan, and former British PM Tony Blair at a Peking University forum on the qualities that make a champion. He sat with his wife Nancy Kissinger, President George W. Bush, former President George H. W. Bush, and Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi at the men's basketball game between China and the U.S. In 2011, Kissinger published on China, chronicling the evolution of Sino-American relations and laying out the challenges to a partnership of genuine strategic trust between the U.S. and China. In this book on China and his 2014 book World Order, as well as in his 2018 interview with Financial Times, Kissinger consistently stated that he believed that China wants to restore its historic role as the Middle Kingdom and be the principal advisor to all humanity. In 2020, during a period of worsening Sino-American relations caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the Hong Kong protests, and the U.S.-China trade war, Kissinger expressed concerns that the United States and China are entering a second Cold War and will eventually become embroiled in a military conflict similar to World War I. He called for Chinese leader Xi Jinping and the incoming U.S. President-elect Joe Biden to take a less confrontational foreign policy. Kissinger previously said that a potential war between China and the United States would be worse than the world wars that ruined European civilization. In July 2023, Kissinger traveled to Beijing to meet with Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu, who was sanctioned by the U.S. government in 2018 for engaging in the purchase of combat aircraft from a Russian arms exporter. Kissinger emphasized Sino-American relations in the meeting, stating that the United States and China should eliminate misunderstandings, coexist peacefully, and avoid confrontation. Later that trip, Kissinger met with Xi with the intention of defrosting relations between the U.S. and China. Kissinger's position on this issue of U.S.-Iran talks was reported by the Tehran Times to be that any direct talks between the U.S. and Iran on issues such as the nuclear dispute would be most likely to succeed if they first involved only diplomatic staff and progressed to the level of Secretary of State before the heads of state meet. In 2016, Kissinger said that the biggest challenge facing the Middle East is the potential domination of the region by an Iran that is both imperial and jihadist. He further wrote in August 2017 that if the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran and its Shiite allies were allowed to fill the territorial vacuum left by a militarily defeated Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, the region would be left with a land corridor extending from Iran to the Levant, which could mark the emergence of an Iranian radical empire. Commenting on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Kissinger said that he would not have agreed to it, but that Trump's plan to end the agreement after it was signed would enable the Iranians to do more than us. On March 5, 2014, The Washington Post published an op-ed piece by Kissinger, 11 days before the Crimean referendum on whether Autonomous Republic of Crimea should officially rejoin Ukraine or join neighboring Russia. In it, he attempted to balance the Ukrainian, Russian, and Western desires for a functional state. He made 4 main points. Ukraine should have the right to choose freely its economic and political associations, including with Europe. Ukraine should not join NATO, a repetition of the position he took 7 years before. Ukraine should be free to create any government compatible with the expressed will of its people. Wise Ukrainian leaders would then opt for a policy of reconciliation between the various parts of their country. He imagined an international position for Ukraine like that of Finland. Ukraine should maintain sovereignty over Crimea. Kissinger also wrote, "The West speaks Ukrainian. The East speaks mostly Russian. Any attempt by one wing of Ukraine to dominate the other, as has been the pattern, would lead eventually to civil war or breakup." Following the publication of his book titled World Order, Kissinger participated in an interview with Charlie Rose and updated his position on Ukraine, which he sees as a possible geographical mediator between Russia and the West. In a question he posed to himself for illustration regarding reconceiving policy regarding Ukraine, Kissinger stated, "If Ukraine is considered an outpost, then the situation is that its eastern border is the NATO strategic line, and NATO will be within 200 miles 320 kilometers of Volgograd. That will never be accepted by Russia. On the other hand, if the Russian western line is at the border of Poland, Europe will be permanently disquieted." The strategic objective should have been to see whether one can build Ukraine as a bridge between East and West, and whether one can do it as a kind of a joint effort. In December 2016, Kissinger advised President-elect Donald Trump to accept Crimea as a part of Russia in an attempt to secure a rapprochement between the United States and Russia, whose relations soured as a result of the Crimean crisis. When asked if he explicitly considered Russia's sovereignty over Crimea legitimate, Kissinger answered in the affirmative, reversing the position he took in his Washington Post op-ed. In 2019, Kissinger wrote about the increasing tendency to give control of nuclear weapons to computers operating with artificial intelligence that adversaries' ignorance of AI-developed configurations will become a strategic advantage. Kissinger argued that giving power to launch nuclear weapons to computers using algorithms to make decisions would eliminate the human factor and give the advantage to the state that had the most effective AI system, as a computer can make decisions about war and peace far faster than any human ever could. Just as an AI-enhanced computer can win chess games by anticipating human decision-making, an AI-enhanced computer could be useful in a crisis, as in a nuclear war. The side that strikes first would have the advantage by destroying the opponent's nuclear capacity. Kissinger also noted there was always the danger that a computer could make a decision to start a nuclear war before diplomacy had been exhausted, or for a reason that would not be understandable to the operators. Kissinger also warned the use of AI to control nuclear weapons would impose opacity on the decision-making process, as the algorithms that control the AI system are not readily understandable, destabilizing the decision-making process. Grand strategy requires an understanding of the capabilities and military deployments of potential adversaries. But if more and more intelligence becomes opaque, how will policymakers understand the views and abilities of their adversaries and perhaps even allies? Will many different internets emerge or, in the end, only one? What will be the implications for cooperation, for confrontation? As AI becomes ubiquitous, new concepts for its security need to emerge. On April 3, 2020, Kissinger shared his diagnostic view of the COVID-19 pandemic, saying that it threatens the liberal world order. Kissinger added that the virus does not know borders, although global leaders are trying to address the crisis on a mainly national basis. He stressed that the key is not a purely national effort, but greater international cooperation. In May 2022, speaking to the World Economic Forum on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Kissinger advocated for a diplomatic settlement that would restore the status quo ante bellum, effectively ceding Crimea and parts of Donbas to Russian control. Kissinger urged Ukrainians to match the heroism they have shown with wisdom, arguing that pursuing the war beyond that point would not be about the freedom of Ukraine, but a new war against Russia itself. He spoke to Edward Luce and a Financial Times audience in the same month. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky rejected Kissinger's suggestions, saying Ukraine would not agree to peace until Russia agreed to return Crimea and the Donbas region to Ukraine. On a book tour to sell leadership, 6 Studies in World Strategy in July 2022, he spoke to Judy Woodruff of PBS, and he was still of the opinion that a negotiation is desirable, and clarified his earlier statement, saying that he supported a ceasefire line on the borders of February 24th, and that Russia should not gain anything from the war. Ukraine, above all, cannot give up territory that it had when the war started, because this would be symbolically dangerous. On January 18, 2023, Kissinger was interviewed by Graham Allison for a World Economic Forum audience. He said that U.S. support should be intensified until either the February 24th borders are reached or the February 24th borders are recognized, upon which time under a ceasefire agreement negotiations would begin. Kissinger felt that Russia needs to be given an opportunity to rejoin the Comity of Nations while the sanctions are maintained until final settlement is reached. He expressed his admiration for President Zelensky and lauded the heroic conduct of the Ukrainian people. Kissinger felt that the invasion has ipso facto its logical outcome pointed to NATO membership for Ukraine at the end of the peace process. In September 2023, Kissinger met with Volodymyr Zelensky in New York City, on which occasion they discussed his change in position on Ukraine's NATO membership ambitions. In a statement made a month before his death, Kissinger responded to the 2023 Hamas-led attack on Israel and outbreak of the 2023 Israel-Hamas war by saying that the goals of Hamas can only be to mobilize the Arab world against Israel and to get off the track of peaceful negotiations. In response to celebrations of the attack by some Arabs in Germany, he issued a statement denouncing Muslim immigration into Germany. It was a grave mistake to let in so many people of totally different culture and religion and concepts, because it creates a pressure group inside each country that does that. A 2014 poll of American international relations scholars conducted by the College of William and Mary ranked Kissinger as the most effective Secretary of State in the 50 years prior to 2015. In 1972, Time commented that a streak of suspicion seems to underlie all that he does, and his jokes about his paranoia have an uncomfortable edge of truth. He was so often seen escorting Hollywood starlets that the Village Voice charged he was a secret square posing as a swinger. The insight, "power is the ultimate aphrodisiac," is widely attributed to him, although Kissinger was paraphrasing Napoleon Bonaparte. Critics on the right, such as Ray Takey, have faulted Kissinger for his role in the Nixon administration's opening to China and secret negotiations with North Vietnam. Takey writes that while rapprochement with China was a worthy goal, the Nixon administration failed to achieve any meaningful concessions from Chinese officials in return, as China continued to support North Vietnam and various revolutionary forces throughout the Third World, nor does there appear to be even a remote, indirect connection between Nixon and Kissinger's diplomacy and the communist leadership's decision, after Mao's bloody rule, to move away from a communist economy towards state capitalism. Historian Jeffrey Kimball developed the theory that Kissinger and the Nixon administration accepted a South Vietnamese collapse provided a face-saving decent interval passed between American withdrawal and defeat. In his first meeting with Zhou Enlai in 1971, Kissinger laid out in detail the settlement terms that would produce such a delayed defeat: total American withdrawal, return of all American POWs, and a ceasefire in place for 18 months or some period, in the words of historian Ken Hughes. On October 6, 1972, Kissinger told Nixon twice that the terms of the Paris Peace Accords would probably destroy South Vietnam. "I also think that Thieu is right, that our terms will eventually destroy him." However, Kissinger denied using a decent interval strategy, writing, "All of us who negotiated the agreement of October 12 were convinced that we had vindicated the anguish of a decade not by a decent interval but by a decent settlement." Johannes Kajara offers a positive assessment of Nixon and Kissinger's strategy, arguing that the two men simultaneously maintained a plan of further supporting Saigon and a plan B of shielding Washington should their maneuvers prove futile. According to Kajara, the decent interval concept has been largely misrepresented, in that Nixon and Kissinger sought to gain time, make the North turn inward, and create a perpetual equilibrium rather than acquiescing in the collapse of South Vietnam. Kissinger's record was brought up during the 2016 Democratic Party presidential primaries. Hillary Clinton had cultivated a close relationship with Kissinger, describing him as a friend and a source of counsel. During the Democratic primary debates, Clinton touted Kissinger's praise for her record as Secretary of State. In response, candidate Bernie Sanders criticized Kissinger and said, "I am proud to say that Henry Kissinger is not my friend. I will not take advice from Henry Kissinger." Kissinger was an immensely beloved figure within China, with China News Service describing him in his obituary as someone who had a sharp vision and a thorough understanding of world affairs. Kissinger has generally received a polarizing reception. Some have portrayed him as a strategic genius who was willing to act in a utilitarian manner. Others have portrayed his foreign policy decisions as immoral and profoundly damaging in the long run. Historian Niall Ferguson has argued that Kissinger is one of the most effective secretaries of state in American history. The editorial board of the Wall Street Journal stated in the aftermath of his death, Kissinger was a target of both the right and left in those perilous Cold War years, often unfairly. The article noted that he was often criticized by American conservatives for overlooking human rights in China, while saying he had no illusions about the Communist Party or its nationalist ambitions. His view was that the U.S. and China had to achieve some modus vivendi to avoid war despite their profound cultural and political differences, while claiming that the alternatives then, as now, weren't usually democracy advocates of the left's imagining. They were often communists who would have aligned themselves with the Soviets. The U.S. provided covert aid to Allen's political opponents, but declassified briefings from the Times show the U.S. was unaware of the military coup that deposed him. Kissinger wasn't responsible for Augusto Pinochet's coup or its bloody excesses. Chile eventually became a democracy. Cuba remains a dictatorship. A number of activists and human rights lawyers have sought to prosecute him for war crimes committed by American allies during his tenure. In September 2001, relatives and survivors of General René Schneider filed civil proceedings in federal court in Washington, D.C. In April 2002, a petition for Kissinger's arrest was filed in the High Court in London by human rights campaigner Peter Tatchell, citing the destruction of civilian populations and the environment in Indochina during the years 1969-197. American-British journalist and author Christopher Hitchens authored The Trial of Henry Kissinger, in which he called for the prosecution of Kissinger for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, and for offenses against common or customary or international law, including conspiracy to commit murder, kidnap, and torture. Anthony Bourdain wrote in A Cook's Tour, "Once you've been to Cambodia, you'll never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands. Witness what did, and you will never understand why he's not sitting in the dock at The Hague next to Milosevic." Author Robert D. Kaplan and historian Niall Ferguson have disputed these notions and argued that there is a double standard in how Kissinger is judged in comparison to others. They have defended Kissinger by arguing that American power to advocate for human rights in other nations is often counterproductive and limited, that taking into consideration geopolitical realities is an inevitable part of any effective foreign policy, and that there are utilitarian reasons to defend most of the decisions of his tenure. Several historians have rejected both prominent reputations of Kissinger. David Greenberg argued that each are exaggerated caricatures that overstate both his genius and immorality. In fact, if there's a single word I'd apply to Kissinger, it's overrated. He was overrated as a scholar, famous mainly for writing a very long dissertation. He was overrated as a strategist. He often gave bad advice, as he did in urging George W. Bush not to withdraw troops from Iraq. He was even overrated as a villain. The Christopher Hitchenses of the world loved to call him a war criminal, but this was a fundamentally unserious charge. The Defense Department, not the State Department, prosecutes wars, and the president oversees it, but the Hitchenses preferred to go after Kissinger rather than Defense Secretaries Mel Laird or James Schlesinger, or even Nixon. Similarly, Mario Del Piero argued, he was not particularly original or bold. Once we scratch away from his writings the deliberately opaque and convoluted prose he often used, possibly to try to render more original thoughts and reflections that were in reality fairly conventional. In short, he wasn't a war criminal. He wasn't a very deep or sophisticated thinker. He rarely challenged the intellectual vogues of the time, even because it would have meant to challenge those in power, something he always was and still is reluctant to do. And once in government, he displayed a certain intellectual laziness vis-a-vis the intricacies and complexities of a world that he still tended to see in black and white. Kissinger married Anneliese Ann Fleischer, born November 6, 1925, in Fürth, Germany on February 6, 1949. They had 2 children, Elizabeth and David, and divorced in 1964. In 1955, he met Austrian poet Ingeborg Bachmann during a symposium at Harvard. The two had a romantic relationship that lasted several years. On March 30, 1974, he married Nancy Magins. They lived in Kent, Connecticut, and in New York City. Kissinger's son David served as an executive with NBC Universal Television Studio before becoming head of Kanako, Conan O'Brien's production company, in 2005. In February 1982, at the age of 58, Henry Kissinger underwent coronary bypass surgery. On May 27, 2023, he turned 100. Kissinger described diplomacy as his favorite game in a 1973 interview. Darrell Grove characterized Kissinger as one of the most influential people in the growth of soccer in the United States. Kissinger was named chairman of the North American Soccer League Board of Directors in 1978. Since his childhood, Kissinger had been a fan of his hometown's soccer club, SBVGG Fürth, now SBVGG Greuther Fürth. Even during his time in office, the German embassy informed him about the team's results every Monday morning. He was an honorary member with lifetime season tickets. In September 2012, Kissinger attended a home game in which Greuther Fürth lost 0-2 against Schalke, after promising years previously that he would attend a Greuther Fürth home game if they were promoted to the Bundesliga, the top football league in Germany from the two. Bundesliga. Kissinger died at his home in Kent, Connecticut, on November 29, 2023, at the age of 100. He is survived by his wife, Nancy Majens Kissinger, 2 children, David and Elizabeth, and 5 grandchildren. His death was announced by Kissinger Associates, his consulting firm. Kissinger Associates announced that the funeral would be private and would be followed by a memorial service in New York City. Kissinger was widely admired within the Chinese Communist Party. Government figures on state media uniformly released posts mourning his death. Chinese social media expressed widespread sorrow after news of his passing was released, and hashtags idolizing Kissinger became the most searched trend in China. News service stated in his obituary that today, this old friend of the Chinese people, who had a sharp vision and a thorough understanding of world affairs, has completed his legendary life. China Central Television, the state broadcaster, called Kissinger a legendary diplomat and a living fossil who had witnessed the development of China-US relations. Shortly before his death, Chinese President Xi Jinping stated, "The Chinese people never forget their old friends, and Sino-US relations will always be linked with the name of Henry Kissinger." Many British prime ministers mourned Kissinger. Tony Blair, the former leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, released a statement saying, "There is no one like Henry Kissinger. From the first time I met him as a new Labour Party opposition leader in 1994, struggling to form views on foreign policy, to the last occasion when I visited him in New York and, later, he spoke at my institute's annual gathering, I was in awe of him. If it is possible for diplomacy, at its highest level, to be a form of art, Henry was an artist." David Cameron stated he was a great statesman and a deeply respected diplomat who will be greatly missed on the world stage. Even at 100, his wisdom and thoughtfulness shone through. I stop at this point today. Thank you for watching. I hope I added something to you. You enjoyed the last few minutes. We will meet with you soon.